Good evening. I'm Melanie Risden with the Western Standard. Last week, we did some extensive coverage of the testimony from Dr. Dina Hinshaw for the lawsuit that is currently sort of underway against the Alberta government for all of the lockdown measures and the chief medical officer of health orders that were issued by Dr. Hinshaw. Joining me to discuss some of that testimony and just walk us through a little bit of what was exposed and what was discussed throughout that testimony is Jeff Rath, one of the lawyers that participated in the lawsuit. Thanks for joining us, Jeff.
Good afternoon, Melanie. Obviously, the thing that I found the most fascinating was the lengths that Dr. Hinshaw went to throw Jason Kenney under the bus last week, repeatedly swearing under oath that the so-called chief medical officer of health orders that have been issued aren't her orders, but are effectively orders from Jason Kenney. I thought that was one of the big takeaways from last week. We were somewhat amazed to hear that, to say the least. One of our other big takeaways last week was that Dr. Hinshaw swore under oath that she didn't understand or didn't know what was more effective, natural immunity, or as she calls it, post-infection immunity or vaccinated immunity. And that's after standing up in public for the last 2.5 years, 2 years, telling people that have had COVID that they should get vaccinated anyway, because vaccinated immunity is better than natural immunity. So I thought that was pretty shocking last week. I certainly thought that was worth the price of admission.
Yeah, I was listening in for her testimony through the week. She testified Monday to Thursday. And I, too, found that interesting. It felt like you sort of had to ask a number of times with regard to the efficacy of the vaccines when it came to producing some form of immunity to COVID-19 versus somebody who has actually contracted COVID-19 and thus would be relying on natural immunity. So what were your thoughts on that?
She wasn't very forthright or forthcoming in much of her testimony. The other thing that I thought was fascinating, the new scare tactic I think that they're using is this alleged existence of long COVID. So everything now is, oh my God, you got to get vaccinated because of long COVID. So they're trying to find new excuses to sell vaccines. And the interesting thing was when I asked her about this alleged long COVID and whether she had any data to support the existence of long COVID in Alberta, or whether she could point to a single case of long COVID in Alberta, she couldn't, but claimed that the reason that she knew it existed was from international publications. So then when I asked her, on the basis that she was completely lacking in data, and I said, so this alleged long COVID you keep talking about, is it possible that this so-called long COVID is in fact people that have recovered from COVID, that have been forced to get vaccinated, who are now vaccine injured, right? And again, she wasn't forthcoming in her answer. And at best, it's clear that she doesn't know whether long COVID exists, whether it's a result of vaccine injuries as opposed to, any such condition as long COVID. And it seemed to me that she was engaged in, basically, the continuation of her ongoing propaganda exercises that she's been subjecting us to for the last, 2 years.
With the topic of long COVID, were you provided anything with any kind of explanation of what you would be experiencing if you
No. And again, oh, sorry. No, I didn't mean to cut you off, Melanie. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's okay.
Explanation. And again, it's just one of those scare tactics that they've been using. It's like, if you remember, when they're trying to keep people locked up in airport hotels or whatever, it was all about variants of concern, being very concerning. We need to be concerned about variants of concern. Well, now it's the same thing with long COVID. They don't know if it exists. There's no cases that they can point to in Alberta. But oh my goodness, we all need to be afraid of long COVID. And this is why parents should rush out and get their children vaccinated, notwithstanding that all the data that's coming out from Pfizer indicates children are more likely to be harmed by the vaccines than they are to be harmed by COVID. So it's just part of this ongoing terror campaign where they're trying to terrorize parents into vaccinating their children against all sound medical advice at this point. So it's, to me, I found that to be pretty shocking. The other thing that I found to be really shocking was on the subject of suicides in Alberta. And when she acknowledged that the table that she put in her affidavit, didn't mean that there were no suicides that were caused by COVID. And all the table said was that there's a 5% decrease from 2020 to 2021. And we can quibble about whether or not, suicides are being buried in drug overdoses or being buried elsewhere. But she did acknowledge that, that she was prepared to accept that her orders may have contributed to suicides in the province. But what really shocked me was, when I kept pressing her on it to try to get a clear answer as to whether or not this was factored into her thinking in terms of a cost-benefit analysis of her orders, and I asked her whether she knew how many people died as a result from suicide as a result of her orders, she said that that was an issue for the medical examiner, chief medical examiner of Alberta. And then when I pressed her on that to ask her whether she'd consulted with the chief medical examiner with regard to how many suicides were attributable to her orders, she hadn't. So, the lack of care that the so-called chief medical officer of health, who claims to be the doctor for all, Albertans and we're all her patients, seems to be exhibiting towards people in this society, to my way of thinking is completely shocking.
Now, I know that during this, you and the other lawyer, Leighton, that you were working with for this lawsuit, you have put together a legal letter and sent it to the chief medical examiner in the province. What were you looking for with that letter, and have you heard anything yet?
We're looking for an investigator to be appointed to look into all of the suicides that occurred in Alberta in 2021 to determine how many of them were directly attributable to COVID. I mean, since we sent that letter out and since the Western Standard did its story, our office has been receiving, a steady stream of letters from family members in Alberta whose family members they believe died as a direct result, from suicide as a direct result of all of the lockdown orders that people have been suffering under. People being, forced against their will to be vaccinated, people losing their jobs because they're not vaccinated, then not being allowed to go to restaurants because they're not vaccinated, and all of the rest of the foolishness that people have been living under in this province. We've received a number of letters from family members of people who've committed suicide as a result of all the psychological pressure that was being placed on them through these completely heartless orders of Dina Hinshaw's.
Well, and not only that, but the isolation. I think the isolation that a lot of people felt played a big part. I know through the pandemic, I spoke with family members who had elderly family members in care facilities. They were not able to see them. They were not able to visit with them. And their health was simply just declining because of the lack of stimulation and how the socialization just keeps us healthy, and I think that's even a provable health statistic. But people who were really concerned about their elderly loved ones feeling so depressed, lonely, and isolated.
No, that's absolutely right. And I mean, and the other issue, we've consulted with psychiatrists who are going to be willing to provide expert testimony in this regard. People that suffer PTSD, and especially, let's look at, victims of sexual assault and people that have suffered, horrific events in their lives and they're suffering from PTSD. Psychiatrists that I've spoken to say that it's, it just completely violates their sense of personal autonomy to be forced through these mandatory vaccine passport programs to be vaccinated against their will, or being threatened, at AHS through the loss of their jobs unless they're vaccinated against their will, or other employers terminating them, because they're not vaccinated, pursuant to all of, Dina Hinshaw's orders, making all of this acceptable in our society. All the psychiatrists that I've spoken to say that this is, that they've had a number of patients who are suffering from PTSD who are on the verge of suicide, because of these heartless orders that were issued without any thought, apparently, or any care as to the effect that they would have on these vulnerable people.
Well, and speaking of that, one of the topics that I'm trying to remember if it was you or Mr. Gray, but went into in depth on the new normal. I feel like it was Leighton Gray that was looking into that. But this idea that Hinshaw brought to a lot of the press conferences and the public addresses in the province of Alberta,
well,
referring to that new normal.
Let's not forget for a second that Dr. Hinshaw was appointed by Rachel Notley. And I mean, all of us just have to look to Shanghai this week and hear the people screaming, in terror, locked in their apartment buildings and starving, to understand, what this could have looked like under a Rachel Notley government. I mean, from the outset, as upset as we've been with Jason Kenney and the fact that he's been unwilling to stand up to the medical tyrants in this country, just imagine if Rachel Notley was in charge, given the fact that her entire position throughout was that Dr. Hinshaw wasn't locking people down hard enough, and that anytime that the boot was taken off people's necks, Rachel Notley would be out front screaming and yelling that people should be, the boot should be on people's necks tighter than it was previously. So I mean, it's a pretty horrific situation when you think about it. And I guess that's one question that we're waiting to see. The judge has put some questions to Dr. Hinshaw in terms of whether the Kenney government ordered her to lock down harder than she wanted. But we said in court that we think it's also a question that needs to be answered as to whether she was ordered to lock down less hard than she wanted. And I think the public deserves these answers, and I certainly hope we get them.
Well, and speaking of that topic, there was part of her testimony that I caught where she did say that that she would advise cabinet and they would form policy decisions, and then the orders were sort of put forward. So from listening to that testimony, it did sound like she was confirming that in fact she was making these recommendations, but ultimately policy was coming from cabinet, and that would mean that the orders were perhaps not formulated directly by her. So what does that mean to you, and what you were fighting for with this lawsuit?
Well, we're challenging orders of the chief medical officer of health. I mean, we say from a legal perspective, if Jason Kenney wants to hide behind cabinet confidentiality, they should have issued these orders under Section 19 of the Emergencies Act, which would then make it a cabinet decision. But instead, they chose to pretend that these were medical orders coming from a medical doctor, and in effect, we're using Deena Hinshaw as a scapegoat, or what we need to determine is whether they're using Deena Hinshaw as a scapegoat for what were purely cabinet decisions, because that goes in large part to whether these orders are even legal under the Public Health Act, given that Section 29 of the Public Health Act says that the chief medical officer of health can do whatever she needs to abate the pandemic if in her opinion it's necessary. So is it her opinion or is it Jason Kenney's opinion? And it's certainly important to know as well, from the standpoint of Section 1 of the Charter, what other alternatives were available. I mean, if they can tell unvaccinated people they're not allowed to go to restaurants, why didn't Deena Hinshaw issue orders to tell people over 60 not to go to restaurants? She certainly had the power to do it. Those are the people that are allegedly, or that are filling the hospitals to the greatest degree, was the evidence in court. And, Deena Hinshaw, completely avoided that question, by again simply say, oh, well, they could get it somewhere else. But again, same issue. If you can tell unvaccinated people they're not allowed to go to a crowded restaurant, a hockey game, whatever it is, why can't you do the same with people over 60 or 65 if your only concern is that the hospitals are filling up? And obviously, I think it's a question of some nicety as to whether she was told that she couldn't isolate the people most likely to end up in hospital, because the people most likely to end up in hospital are most likely to donate money to the UCP. Right? So, I mean, it's a question of some nicety, and these questions, are not being answered.
Right. Now, so having said all of that, would that then change? Like, so if your argument is that these orders, in fact, should have come not as chief medical officer of health orders, but under the Emergencies Act, or whatever section of the government that would come under, does that change the position for you if that is the case? Because I know part of the problem was we couldn't hear from Hinshaw on those particular questions because of the Crown had invoked a cabinet confidentiality argument, basically saying, yeah, go ahead, speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, we're still waiting for Madam Justice Romaine to rule on that point. We say that the case law that they've submitted doesn't apply in this case because of the level of decision making.
Well, explain it a little bit first. You'll do a much better job than me. What they tried to do.
So generally, the doctrine of cabinet confidentiality exists to. So, in other words, individual cabinet ministers, if they express negative views that might be politically harmful to them and their, in their constituencies, should be able to speak frankly without fear of political backlash. That's why the doctrine exists.
Okay,
that's also why we didn't ask specific questions as to who in cabinet ordered her to do what. We simply asked whether cabinet itself overruled what should have been her medical advice. And that's the issue that the court's ruling on right now. And we say that because of the level of decision making, which is it's allegedly, Dr. Hinshaw issuing orders as a medical doctor under the Public Health Act, then cabinet confidentiality shouldn't apply if cabinet is interfering in the issuance of those orders. To our way of thinking, that would be no different than a member of cabinet interfering in a judicial process by phoning a judge behind the scenes and trying to put their thumb on the scale. The Public Health Act is very clear. It's supposed to be Dina Hinshaw as the Chief Medical Officer of Health's opinion, not the opinion of Jason Kenney telling her what to do so that they can all pretend that, that these were public health orders as opposed to political orders, being issued by Jason Kenney. It's also, pretty odd that she claims to be she claims that we're all of her patients and that she's the doctor for everybody in Alberta. I pointed out in the hearing that, there's no doctor in the world that should keep their license if they tell their patient, oh, wait a minute, before, I give you any treatment or before I continue with this surgery, let me stop and check with the political commissars who tell me how to practice medicine as to whether or not I'm entitled or allowed to practice medicine on my patient or whether or not it's politically acceptable or unacceptable. To me, this takes us straight into, the days of the Soviet Union, when you had, political officers and political commissars behind every decision that was being made in society. And it seems that that's where we're at again, according to Dina Hinshaw.
So legally, if it turned out that was something sort of provable, that these decisions were actually not made from her, is there consequence to that?
Well, we would say the consequence from that is that these are not decisions that were made under Section 29 of the Public Health Act and are accordingly illegal or ultra vires, which is what we pled in our pleadings. The government's trying to pretend that, oh, well, this is all perfectly normal. In soliciting all of this advice, she has to take advice. She needs to consult with cabinet and take their views into account. But that's not what she was saying. She wasn't saying, I consult with them and then I make up my own mind and my own independent medical opinion. She says, I just gave them advice and then they told me what to do. So, again, it seemed to me that she spent the entire week throwing Jason Kenney under the bus because they want to take responsibility for, some really questionable decisions, including the best summer ever policy. And, the fact that I think it's pretty clear that she didn't want to open up for summer, in 2021, but she was ordered to do it against medical advice.
Sorry.
Was that Jason Nixon in the background, or?
No, I do have dogs though that are reacting to our interview. So sorry about that. But interestingly, then with that idea, and so there were questions that you were posing to Dr. Dina Hinshaw. She was not able to answer because of the Crown saying that there was this cabinet privilege, or and you are waiting for the judge to rule on that. The judge did bring some questions to her privately, and so that's what we're waiting for, is for her to determine the.
Well, I think the process is the judge is going to make a ruling on the law, with regard to cabinet confidentiality, and then if she determines that it's an either an open issue or an arguable issue, she would then put those questions to she's put the questions to Dr. Hinshaw, and I think depending on what her ruling is on cabinet confidentiality, she may or may not put the answers to those questions on the record, right? And then that may or may not, open it up for us to ask further questions of Dr. Hinshaw, I think is where we're at in the process. So okay. We're still waiting for that ruling.
Okay, and then once you find out that ruling, that will determine whether you have the need to ask any further questions or not. And then we're into sort of closing arguments from both sides.
Yeah, and we're going to be submitting written closing arguments, is what we've been advised by the court. So that's the process that we'll be following.
Now, with written submitted closing arguments, does that somehow prevent the public generally from being able to see or hear?
No, because they'll be filed as part of the public record. So they would be available to the public at large.
Okay, and we will definitely receive yours and follow up and likely do an interview, and we can talk through some of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you get a sense, can you even speak to this right now? Did you get a sense which direction you think things are going to go?
Oh, I couldn't comment on that at this stage in the proceedings, Melanie. It wouldn't be appropriate from a professional perspective.
Fair enough.
But I have to say that the evidence that we've seen to date, has been quite eye-opening. In terms of a lot of the issues that we've discussed, and the evidence that wasn't tendered by the government. I mean, they haven't shown, to anybody's satisfaction that they actually took that they actually really considered the negative consequences of all of those lockdown orders on human life in Alberta, increased suicides, increased opioid addiction, increased alcohol addiction, business bankruptcies, the degree to which, our economy, the billions of dollars that have been taken out of our economy. I mean, I'd like all of your viewers and all of your listeners to consider that the Hinshaw orders likely took $1 billion or more out of the Alberta economy. If even half of that had been put back into the healthcare system in this province, with doctors being given raises and nurses being given raises and people within that system being treated appropriately, with Verna Yu being fired much earlier than she was and somebody competent being put in charge of AHS, how much better off we would have been, because the suggestion that we're getting under this whole new normal idea from Dina Hinshaw is that on a going forward basis, anytime we have a respiratory outbreak, a respiratory disease outbreak that taxes our hospitals, we can all be locked up in our homes again. This is the new normal. And I mean, this new normal only exists because of underfunding of our healthcare system, by the government of Alberta. So, I'd like everybody to consider that, next time they think that, the next time they go to the polls to vote for somebody. Because clearly we're being misled with regard to healthcare in this province.
Mm-hmm. I know we just published a story within the last couple of days on the Western Standard about the fact that very few provinces, even with the billions that were spent throughout the pandemic across the country, very few provinces actually saw an increase in their capacities in their hospitals, an increase in beds and healthcare workers to sort of man those beds. So one would wonder, were the right steps taken? And I think that's what the argument comes down to. Did we make the right decisions?
Our benighted prime minister put over $600 billion into CERB. Think about what healthcare across Canada would look like if even half of that had been put into, healthcare. And I mean, if we have a shortage of doctors and nurses, then, anybody that qualifies for, why didn't we, if we're on a wartime emergency footing, why didn't we go into, emergency training of doctors and nurses in Canada and put $100 billion into subsidizing doctors and nurses' educations and paying people to go to medical school, or pay people to go to nursing school, or pay people to be respiratory therapists, instead of giving all of this money to people who don't need the money to stay home and play Nintendo in mommy and daddy's basement. I mean, it's just been shocking the way that all of this has been handled by, complete incompetence at every level of government.
When are you expecting to be submitting these, your closing arguments, your final arguments for this? And when do you think people can be expecting to have an idea of where this is going?
I would imagine within the next couple of weeks. We're still waiting for that one ruling from Justice Romaine, so we're looking forward to that. And then, following that, I believe we'll be in with the court next week, and we'll be discussing, the timing of filing a final argument. So, I would suspect within the next few weeks, for sure.
If you don't see what you're hoping or what you're expecting out of this, is there an appeal process? What's next?
Well, the funny thing about that is the government of Alberta has already put Justice Romaine on notice that if the ruling goes against them on cabinet privilege, they intend to make an application to her for an emergency stay of her order, and that they would be undertaking an emergency appeal to the Court of Appeal. That's how desperate Jason Kenney is to keep the truth from coming out as to the extent to which he was the one issuing the orders as opposed to Dina Hinshaw. Well,
that's interesting. Is that normal? Would you have expected to see that?
It's not very often that that lawyers tell a judge in advance of a ruling that they intend to appeal it if it goes the wrong way. So, I mean, take it for what it's worth, but it's certainly an unusual tactic, I have to say.
Now, perhaps you can just fill me in. If you are successful, what is the consequence? What happens? What are you? What?
Well, I mean, all that happens is that the three questions that the judge put to Dr. Hinshaw, are put on the record, and then we determine whether or not we're permitted to ask any further questions, on that same line of questioning to fill in whatever gaps exist, and then we would go to final argument, right? So, that's where that's at. And then if the judge, if the judge doesn't rule in our favor, we still go to final, argument. At the end of the day, I don't think that we'd be bringing in an emergency appeal, right?
No, but I mean, if
as has been threatened by the government of Alberta.
Right, but I guess my question is if the lawsuit is successful in your favor, what's the consequence? Does Dr. Hinshaw need to step down? Is there?
Well, those are political questions. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that the consequence is that the government, the people of the province of Alberta, have some really clear guidance as to whether what they've been suffering, for the last, up until, because this hearing sort of cuts off at the date of Dina Hinshaw's affidavit, which was July of 2021. Whether all of the orders and decisions made up to July of 2021 were lawful, either under the charter or either under the Bill of Rights. And then at that point, everybody can advise themselves accordingly in terms of the remedies, right? at this point, we're still just seeking to have all of those orders struck down. A lot of it, is could arguably be moot. But I think it's important, for people to know whether what we've suffered in the eyes of our courts was legal or not. Mm-hmm. Certainly our clients take the position that it wasn't. It was also extremely telling that, Dr. Hinshaw admitted, that she never attended, my client's gym, didn't understand, how it was that my client could operate her gym safely within the context of a COVID environment, didn't know that there'd been no reported cases of COVID that could be traced to my client's gym, et cetera. Yet, my client suffered nonetheless, so, those are all things that people need to take into account. And I think there has to be some transparency here so that people can understand what was going on in our society.
Couple more questions. So in the situation where you are successful with this lawsuit, does it open the door for people to then, sue for losses, damages, whether it's, loss of employment or the crumbling of their business, or, any of the sort of economic or
I certainly think all of those things are on the table. And again, we'll just have to see where we end up at the end of the day in the context of whatever ruling comes from the court. The other thing that was really interesting, and I think people that are listening and paying attention to what's going on, everybody needs to start writing their MLA and demanding a public inquiry into everything that went on, under Dr. Hinshaw's medical dictatorship in this province. The government lawyers throughout this case repeatedly state on the record that this is not a public inquiry. We're restricted to these narrow issues. Well, there needs to be a public inquiry. People need to know, who's responsible for their loved ones committing suicide. People need to know who's responsible for bankrupting their businesses and destroying the economic self-sufficiency of their families. People need to know, who actually is responsible for, the loss of liberty in this province, and the idea that the loss of liberty in this province, anytime a hospital gets overcrowded, is the new normal. These are questions that Albertans demand answers to. And as much as Jason Kenney wants to run and hide, from the issue, the provincial equivalent of a royal commission needs to be established sooner rather than later to look into all of these issues. And if Jason Kenney, really had the guts that he claims that he has, then he should be waiving cabinet privilege, and it should all be on the table so that people can see what was going on throughout. I mean, it shouldn't be any real political risk to him, because the reality of it is Rachel Notley's position is that she would have locked down harder and hurt people more. So where's the political downside for him anyway? Given that, Rachel Notley would turn Alberta into Shanghai if she's given the opportunity.
Well, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier too, I think it also, the goal should be to really assess the decisions that were made and how we would move through something like this again and avoid the negative, making sure that the decisions that are made in the future for something similar would be less damaging economically, socially,
Well, that's the entire point of a public inquiry,
right?
Because the government certainly doesn't seem to have carried out an appropriate that's the issue before the court, is whether or not the government carried out an appropriate Section 1 analysis under the Oakes test. It certainly doesn't seem like they have on the basis of the evidence before the court. And certainly, all of that needs to be considered in the context of a public inquiry, as to whether or not there was a massive failure and breach of the public trust by not considering those issues. Like, why wasn't Dina Hinshaw consulting with the chief medical examiner with regard to how many suicides in 2021 and onward, were in fact caused by her lockdown orders? Why wasn't Jason Kenney doing that, as opposed to just spewing propaganda about how overall the suicide rate was down by 5%? When we all know that there were people that were killing themselves because of the devastation of their businesses and the degree to which people were being, losing their jobs and being coerced against their will, into being vaccinated with products which are appearing more and more to be purely experimental in violation of the Nuremberg Code.
Well, we're hoping you'll keep us updated if and when you do hear back from the chief medical examiner on your inquiry about, an investigation into those suicides that would be considered linked to some of those lockdown measures, and certainly plan to touch base with you in the coming weeks when you do hear back from the judge and we do get a ruling on this.
Yeah, we certainly do intend to follow up with the chief medical examiner, with regard to both Mr. Gray and my letter of last week. So if we hear anything on that, believe me, I'll keep you posted.
All right. Well, thanks very much for joining us for the update and for sort of your analysis of how the testimony went last week. And we will keep in touch and we will follow up with you in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you again to everybody at the Western Standard for the excellent job they've been doing covering this. So thank you again.
Thanks, Jeff.